today is titled Truth and Reconciliation for Indigenous Womanhood. So before I dive in deeper, I want to introduce myself. Bojo, Ani, Tamara Indigenous Makwana Dodam. I'm Gashizangi Anishinabek. So I'm from Galway First Nation, also known as Lake Nipigon. That's where I call my home. I'm part of the Bear Clan. I'm the eldest daughter of my parents, and I'm also a proud member of the 1850 Robinson Superior Treaty. I'm here today to share my personal stories as an Indigenous woman and what that may look like for me, what Truth and Reconciliation can do. So I'm going to share stories of my learning journey on Indigenous womanhood and how I believe it's deeply connected to the acts that need to happen in society, especially within our education institutions, on learning on Indigenous womanhood. But first, what is truth and what is reconciliation? So truth is the revealing of interactions historically and contemporary of what happened here in our country, Canada, with Indigenous peoples. Reconciliation is the hope of resolving any conflict by changing policies, systems, and programs with the aim of restoring friendly relations, with those relations to ripple across our nation for reconciliation between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples. The TRC was first launched in 2008 in regards about the Indian residential school legacy here in Canada. The hope was to find hope of healing between two nations of peoples, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and ways to move forward to remedy the past and build a mutual understanding of one another. So why Indigenous womanhood? I need to share that woman is rooted in medicine lines. Medicine lines that are tied to the land, to the water, to her being, to her heart, to the spirit world and the cosmos. Especially because Indigenous women are not only water protectors, but we're water carriers. So when we think of woman when she's pregnant in her utero, all that sacred water that's protecting the growing fetus, it's vital to recognize the exchange of energy that happens there. And how those medicine lines from the land and our ancestors feed that sacred water. Therefore, that transmission of medicine lines then go to the growing fetus. And did you know, when you're approximately 6 months in utero, especially if you're a female baby growing in utero, your ovaries develop. So therefore, when my Nokomis was pregnant with my mom, and when my mom reached the digestion development in utero at 6 months, I was there in her ovaries. That's something that's very important to think about, and the impact of that transition of energies, knowledge, and medicines. And I say that because when we reflect upon what are we learning about Indigenous womanhood. Now, when we talk about truth and reconciliation and building these pathways to meet on the bridge of understanding, what if I was to tell you, perhaps unintentionally, our education systems are using teaching tools that normalize violence against Indigenous women and girls? What if I was to tell you that this normalization influences our children's thinking at early age, their understanding, their perceptions of how the world works? And that includes people too. What if I was to tell you that the story of Pocahontas, that is still used today as a cultural component and learning tool within mainstream education, actually reinforces the normalization of violence against Indigenous women and girls. Now, shift a little and think, if you're an Indigenous girl in your class and the teacher is telling this story, how would you feel? More so, as non-Indigenous peers are learning that we're deeming it appropriate to sexualize, racialize, and genderize and discriminate against Indigenous women. So, how do we ever come to terms on meeting on the bridge of understanding what Indigenous womanhood is and what that would look like for truth and reconciliation? So let's go back to the story of Pocahontas. Truth, she was an 11-year-old girl who was taken captive. Some say it was a true love story. Some say it was circumstantial due to the way that her and John Smith fell in love. Fact, this could be argued as the first documented case of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Fact, this was documented in 1614. The timeline that we're using within research, within media, within literature, education, about missing and murdered is from 1980 to 2012, when the crisis has been happening for centuries. So, reconciliation, we need to learn about Indigenous womanhood beyond these time frames. We need to learn the realities of violence that Indigenous women and girls are facing in our society in all shapes or forms. Pocahontas, the story of Pocahontas is considered textual violence, literary violence, that reinforces and normalizes the sexual racialized violence against Indigenous women and girls. In fact, in 2014, there was a literature review on Indigenous women and girls in Canada in correlation to violence, and two discourses came out as overarching themes. One, the blame was already put back on the women. Two, the rationale for so is because they live precarious lifestyles. In the work that I do, as well, in research for MMIW here in our country, specifically focusing on Ontario, I have learned that the literature and research and documents tend to overlook the deep-seated history of colonial violence that lead women to vulnerable spaces. We don't talk about how when Indigenous women married a non-Indigenous man, that she lost her rights. She lost her status, and if she had children with him, they also lost their status and rights. And most often, because they were considered not an Indian anymore, they were forced to leave their communities, therefore forced into unfamiliar spaces and land, trying to find a home, a safe space for themselves, and if they have children. Talk about vulnerable. So, not only is the literature disregarding the colonial history, the deep-seated racism and discrimination that's happened, but we're also missing the focus on the strength of these women. And more importantly, the stories, the medicine lines. And what impacts does this have? So we gave an example, the Pocahontas story in a classroom. We talked about the sacredity of being a woman in water and us being water carriers. Now, did you know that our bodies are approximately 60% water? And I'm going to be sharing Dr. Emoto's study here, where he actually showed the physical reality impact of negative and positive emotions and thoughts on water, where he showed that water that was said, I'll kill you, I hate you, you're ugly, you're not worthy. When he froze it, it didn't crystallize as beautifully as the water that said, you're beautiful, I love you, you're accepted, thank you. Now hold on to that thought for 1 second. If our bodies are made of 60% water, what does that mean when we are a young Indigenous girl trying to learn who we are? And we're hearing these stories, these portrayals in the media, fingers of blame put back on us. How will that make you feel? How does that impact your physiology of your body? There is a strong correlation of how your mindset determines your overall mental health and how stress influences your overall well-being and your health outcomes for your bone density and organs and your heart. More so, it's important to identify there is a strong link between cultural identity and mental health outcomes. So when we talk about the disparities of mental health within Indigenous populations, we need to acknowledge the violence of the Canadian residential schools, the 60 Scoops, we need to talk about MMIW, and the ongoing violence that continues to happen. There remains this complex issue that we're not all talking about. There needs to be more stories. So why does this matter? Why am I up here telling you guys all of these facts, talking about our water physiology and how it impacts our determinants of health? Why does this matter at the end of the day? It matters because, for me, I'm going to be sharing my learning journey on womanhood and mothering. So my great-grandmother, Jane Bernard, was taken here in Thunder Bay in 1966, where it became, and to this day, it's a cold case. It was a double homicide with Doreen Hardy. I never got to know who Jane was as a woman. Growing up, all I ever heard was her death, which made it very difficult for my Nokomis, who's in this picture holding my son, to talk about. So therefore, my birth mother never learned very much about Jane either. Furthermore, my Nokomis is a survivor of the Canadian residential schools. My birth mother was taken in the 60 Scoops as well in boarding schools. So there's this continued disruption of role of motherhood and what healthy mothering looks like. So when we have that for our Indigenous women in communities and families and populations, this energy of trauma, unresolved trauma, and this disruption on learning who am I as a woman and who am I as a mother, ripple effects into the children. And it's important to recognize that motherhood is a role of leadership, and that leadership ensures the health and safety and well-being of not only of the children, but the communities as well. But when there's disruption and unfamiliarity of what that role looks like, there's a continuum of cycle. But if we're put into education systems that do not honor the role of Indigenous womanhood, and we're learning these negative, sexualized, racialized portrayals, where does that put us? So I ask again, what does truth and reconciliation look like for Indigenous womanhood? It wasn't until my mid-20s I finally learned who Jane was as a woman. And I soon learned what it meant to be an Ojibwe woman from Lake Nipigon. And that was really important to me, because the more I tried to dig into the books about Lake Nipigon here, or even Robinson Superior, I found majority of the literature was written by men, especially Duncan Campbell Scott, who will refer to our women as savages or squaws and as slaves, and less than other. So again, I'm trying to learn. I'm trying to understand my identity. And as we already shared, the cultural identity component is highly correlated with mental health outcomes. Because what I learn, what I know, is what I pass to my children. And that ripple effect continues. So I began advocating for our women as more than murdered and missing. Because from my journey of trying to learn and understand who I am as an Ojibwe woman was something I saw a gap within many levels within our system, and I didn't want to see another woman go through the turbulence of trying to understand and or trying to find stories in literature that related. And so I began restoring my lines of womanhood. And what does that mean? When my no-commits went through her healing journey, she was finally ready to share stories on Jane. And what I learned about Jane is that she took on the role of leadership within our community. She harvested from the land. She was a trapper. We had a trap line. She believed in community spirit, which she said when there was clothes that were worn and torn, she would cut them up and make baby clothes out of them and distribute them throughout the community. She would portage down through Lake Nipigon, make it over to Beardmore, and then Beardmore, make it to Thunder Bay to collect any necessities of needs, like medicine, because Gull Bay at that time was a fly-out community. But we don't talk about those stories, because what they did was instead they talked about Jane and her death and portrayed her as a sex worker, a 43-year-old woman. And again, blaming the fault back on her for being taken and murdered. So it's important to understand that although we have these stats, although we have these reports on missing and murdered and violence, we need to ask ourselves, but who was she? Who was she as a woman? What were her dreams? What were her aspirations? So I began sharing stories as much as I can to inspire our children and youth to ask these questions about their family and the line of womanhood. Indigenous or not, learn your line, your family line, your identity, and the gifts, dreams, aspirations. And so I was fortunate enough to work with non-for-profit organizations where province-wide I have been doing these art installations. And as we know, when we share story, we're reliving. But through art and the different mediums that we can express our story is trauma-informed. And it produces healing at a new level that we're not familiar with. So I was happy to share that See Me, the art installation that's permanently housed at Lost in London, Ontario, is a popular demand exhibit. It's still standing this day since 2015. To this day, it is a guided exhibit that brings conversation beyond the statistical representation of missing and murdered. In this past year, I had an exhibit here located in Thunder Bay, honoring womanhood from Robinson Superior Treaty. And again, grounded in ceremony, different generations gathering together. And it was remarkable to see the response from all different people, from different institutions, systems, agencies, organizations, genuinely wanting to learn more. Because this is not what we're learning in the school and education system. So, international research shows how we need to empower our Indigenous women locally to have their voices heard, to self-determine their solutions to combat violence. And that's in all forms of violence. Because if women are not given the tools to challenge these issues like trauma, then these issues impact the whole community. Like the saying says, happy mom, happy baby, happy community. So woman is the first educator rooted in stories from the beginning of time with the creation story here for Turtle Island that teaches us that individually and collectively, by promoting the maintenance of our health, our spirit, relationships to the land and communities, by reconnecting to our spirit and land through ceremony, it's like we make a collective agreement to do better in the world, to support one each other on our healing journey, wherever shape or form we're at with it. We have to remember that we need to introduce the good life, the meaning of the bads, and one way of living. And everyone's way of living a good life is different. So what is truth and reconciliation for Indigenous womanhood? Is asking, who was she as a woman? What were her hopes and dreams? Have those voices, those stories of survivors of violence and family members and communities and leaders and advocates to be heard, so we can have real solutions that can combat the violence that every day that these women are facing. Why is this important? Because it influences our future generations. If we don't act today to fossilize these stories and integrate them into our classrooms, I fear that we will never honor Indigenous womanhood the way it needs to, and the crisis of MMIW will continue. So let's encourage one another to speak our truths and build reconciliation today in society. Miigwech.